to thank you all for joining us today for the Handling Sensitive Investigations in Rural Communities, Sexual Assault and Intimate Partner Violence Cases webinar, hosted by the Rural Violent Crime Reduction Initiative, or RVCRI for short. My name is Samantha Reinierson, and I'm a program manager here at the National Policing Institute for the RVCRI team. And I'm joined today by our two co-presenter, Brian Eads, who is an investigator at the Gering, Nebraska Police Department, and also Michael Tunink of the Coconino County, Arizona County Attorney's Office. Before we dive in today, I do want to talk through a few event logistics. One, today's webinar is being recorded. We will share the presentation recording as well as the PowerPoint through the ruralvcri.org website. All attendees have been muted today to prevent background noise from coming into the event. There will be a brief evaluation survey at the end of the event that we'll ask you all to complete. It should only take a few moments of your time, and we do appreciate any feedback that you all provide. It helps us improve for our future events. And lastly, there will be a Q&A section at the end of today's webinar. So along the way, if you do have any questions for our presenters, please feel free to start putting those into the chat or the Q&A feature that you see along the bottom of your screen throughout today's presentation. I do want to quickly introduce our two presenters for today's event. So I mentioned Brian Eads is an investigator at the Gering, Nebraska Police Department, where he currently serves as their investigator. Prior to that, he worked at the Nebraska State Patrol, where he reached the rank of lieutenant and division commander of investigations. Along the way, he has garnered a lot of experience in investigations on various topics, as well as liaising with multiple criminal justice partners and tribal entities. Our second presenter for today is Michael. He is a senior criminal attorney with the Coconino County, Arizona County Attorney's Office, where he has extensive legal experience working in rural communities. He currently is over the felony prosecutions for Coconino County and has almost 15 years of legal experience. His work has received several awards over the years from victim services programs, as well as from the Navajo Crime Symposium. What we do hope to accomplish with today's webinar is a couple of objectives. One, we would like to review how sensitive cases may be handled differently in rural versus urban communities, learn how to navigate those small town relationships that may impact a sensitive investigation, discuss effective victim-centered and trauma-informed responses, and also learn how to engage with the various partners who may be involved, like those tribal partners, as well as prosecutors, DA investigators, and others. And then, as I mentioned at the end, we will have a Q&A section for folks to ask questions and have those answers by our presenters. So with that, I am going to turn it over to our first presenter. So Brian, the floor is yours.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for coming. First off, I want to tell everybody that, one, I really love public speaking, but I have what my wife describes as really weird ADD. So I'll get off on some weird tangents. So Sam's going to kind of keep me focused and run my slides for me. I'm more of a shoot from the hip kind of speaker. So I want to touch a little bit on the law enforcement response to sensitive investigations. In my time with the Nebraska State Patrol, I had a chance to work in both fairly urban areas, as well as literally some of the most rural areas of Nebraska, where you can go miles without even seeing another house, let alone businesses or industry. And although the basic premises of law enforcement doesn't change, some of the tactics are employed a little bit differently because of the environment. So next slide, please. So rural versus urban resources. Victim cooperation, how does that affect that? My experience is when you're dealing with a victim of a violent sexual crime or a domestic violence crime, their cooperation is going to hinge a little bit on how confident they are that you're going to be able to protect them, that you can get them out of the environment they're in. And if they're not confident of that, their cooperation is going to be affected. So the more you can put them at ease and assure them that today is going to be the last day that you're going to be subjected to what just happened, the more cooperation you're going to get from them. Now, how does the resources side of that affect that? Availability of resources in a rural area are greatly different than they are in the urban area. And they're going to be different from one state to the next, as I've seen throughout my career. On our next slide there, it talks about the lack of shelters. Where I'm at, we don't have a shelter for domestic violence, sexual violence. We have an organization that helps out with that, but they don't have an actual designated shelter. They will put people up in hotel rooms, help with getting them relocated if possible, but we don't have an actual quote unquote shelter. And a lot of that is going to depend on, even as much as, did this incident happen at the beginning of the year or is it the end of the year? Because a lot of these groups are 501c3 funded, funded through donations, funded through other organizations like United Way, things like that. And once that money runs out, it's out. So I've seen it where I've had very violent cases and I was only able to get somebody in a hotel for 2 nights because that's the amount of money that was left over. That's going to greatly affect what you can provide for services. Next one is the hotel provisions. It's just that where I'm at, it's hotels. And sometimes, unfortunately, not the nicest hotels, because when money gets tight, if they can put you up in a little bit lower class hotel for longer, that's probably the route they're going to do because they can serve you for a little bit longer. But there are other options and things to look at. Next slide. So one of the things to look at is I stumbled across by accident. I do quite a bit of social media stuff. I do a lot of TikTok. Really enjoy it. And one of the things I do on there is social media advocacy for domestic violence and sexual violence victims. And I kind of stumbled on that by accident. Back in the days of COVID, I had a victim reach out to me that was being very, very badly beaten every day. But she was in Arkansas and her shelter had just shut down because of COVID. They lost their funding and they went out of business. So she was able to tell me where she was at. I was able to do some Google searching and find that there was a shelter, I think it was about 105 miles away from where she was. Checked with that shelter. They were actually a really good shelter. They were able to provide travel funding, hotels, food vouchers, the whole 9 yards. We just had to get her there. And her perpetrator was very controlling of every aspect and would give her just enough gas to get to the grocery store and back. And then he would pay for the groceries ahead of time. So she didn't have money. She didn't have access to money. I cashed after literally just enough money to get gas to get to the shelter. They took care of everything else and enough to get her 3 states away back home to her mom. So those avenues do exist out there. You just might have to think a little bit outside the box. The other one is I worked with a victim out of California, a situation, and I will say their resources are leaps and bounds ahead of anything I've seen. They have the true safe houses and the shelters, and the timeframes on them are very, very generous, which is great. The other thing is some of those do allow outside resources to come into them. So again, when you're in a rural environment, one of the things that you might have to look at to get outside the box is, can I get this person somewhere else where the services do exist? Do they accept outside relocations? Some of them do, some of them don't, but it's definitely worth checking into. Next slide, please. So where I'm at when it comes to the child advocacy centers, every child victim we have gets a forensic interview at the Child Advocacy Center here. This slide refers to my geographical area. So for us, our Child Advocacy Center is called Capstone. And they have one main office, which is here in the city that I'm in Gering, Nebraska. Then they have 3 satellite offices, one in Chadron, one in Alliance, one in Sydney. Now, those 4 locations serve 11 counties. So there's going to be some driving depending on where you're at. Obviously, now I work for Gering, so I'm in the same location as their main headquarters. When I was with State Patrol, I used those satellite offices a lot. And when I talk satellite offices, they're unmanned. So the interviewers from the central location are also the interviewers in the satellite locations. So you have to schedule that interview for a day they're going to be at that particular location. It's not one of those where, hey, I've got this case that just happened. I need an interview. Well, tough. It's going to be 2 or 3 days before they're in your location, unless you're willing to get the family loaded up and take them down to the central location, which happens. I mean, there's a lot of times we have to pay for the fuel and everything to get them where we need them to get them. That's one of the big differences I see in the rural areas, where on the other end of Nebraska in Omaha, their advocacy center is massive. They have sane exam nurses on staff. They have counseling on staff. Everything is done in-house. With us, we've got the partners, but you're going to have to do some commuting. You're going to have to do some logistical changes to get those services to happen. They're still there, but you're going to have to work for it. All right, next slide, please. Small town relationships affecting on sensitive investigations. So I'm used to small town. I grew up on a ranch about 10 miles away from a town of about 1,960 people. I still live on that ranch today. So I'm used to rural. My closest neighbor is a mile away, and that's my mom. Beyond that, it's another mile before you see another person. So I'm used to the rural side, but it was still a shock for me when I got into law enforcement and saw how that small town affected law enforcement side of it. So in law enforcement, you know, well, in rural and anything, anonymity is hard. You know, the old saying of, you know, everything in a small town, you know what everybody's doing. That's absolutely true. But that also affects law enforcement to where it's a lot harder for me to keep sensitive investigations sensitive and private. So I had one that I give as an example. I had a mom of a young victim who, after the forensic interview, she came to me and she's like, I have a favor to ask. I'm like, sure, if I can grant it, let me know. She's like, I want you to keep this away from the child advocate at the prosecutor's office. I'm like, okay, well, that's a really unusual request. I kind of need to know why. She's like, well, she's my best friend. And I'm like, okay, so why would you want this kept from your best friend? She said, well, because my best friend is also one of the biggest gossips I know, and I'm afraid she will disclose it within our circle, and I don't want our circle to know the inner secrets of my daughter. Like, no, that's fair. And so I had to meet with the prosecutor and just tell him, you know, hey, can we bring in an outside victim advocate? They only had one at my prosecutor's office, and we were able to work around that. And fortunately, they came to me and let me know those problems, because those things do exist, especially in a small town where you know everybody. And like I said, it wasn't that they disliked each other. They were best of friends. But because of that friendship, they knew that she was a bit of a gossip, and they were afraid that was going to affect it. So those are some of the things you're going to have to deal with in a small town. Next slide. And this is one that Michael, I'm sure, can attest to as well, that sometimes, depending on the case, I've had some where jury selection was a bear. We had to bring in 2, 3, sometimes more pools of jurors just to try to seat a jury, just because of everybody knows everybody. They've heard something that's tainted them. And on those cases, I've worked a lot with prosecutors where they'll get me the jury list and have me look through them and say, hey, is there anybody in here that right off the bat you have a concern about? Somebody that we have to exclude right away, or anything else, somebody that's tied to the case through shirt tail or gossip or rumors. And by the time you get done doing that, it's really tough to seat a jury. So next slide. So best practices for implementing victim-centered and trauma approach. So big thing I tell people is to engage with the victim and build a little bit of mutual respect. I tell them that obviously we're talking about some of the deepest, darkest secrets that you've ever encountered. And although you're sharing those with me, I haven't shared any of my deepest, darkest secrets with you. And through this investigation, I'm probably not going to. But I'm still going to ask you to have at least the limited trust that what I tell you I'm going to do, that I'm going to follow through with. I'm going to carry it out. If I tell you that I'm going to do everything to keep you safe, then I absolutely will. If I tell you that I'm going to get you a meeting with somebody, then you can bet that's going to happen. You got to keep your word. You have to engage with them, and you have to mean what you say. And if you can't do that, then you need to find somebody else who can. You need to be big enough to know when your limitations are. And if you're exceeding them, then you tap out and you find somebody else that can follow through with it. And that's a hard thing to do in, these professional environments. It's hard to admit that I can't do this. I've had to do it. There's some cases where it's like, this isn't me. I can't fulfill what this needs, but I'll find somebody that can. All right, next slide. So it's like I say, engage with the victim, build that mutual respect. Next part. Just remember that the victim is the most important thing to your investigation. As a cop, we get really hung up on, this is my case. And it's, my ego really depends on the furtherance of this case, and I have to get it to a prosecution, and it has to be successful. When it comes to a victim-centered approach, the victim is the only thing that matters. If when you're done, regardless of the outcome of the case, whether charges get filed, whether you get that prosecution, whether you get a conviction, if the victim is satisfied with how things went, then I've done my job. I've kept them at the forefront, and them as the most important part of this case. Next slide. We also need to have a commitment to that cultural proficiency. A victim of any culture should feel just as welcome to walk through my doors as any other culture. Where I'm at, Western Nebraska, it's predominantly Caucasian area. We have decent amount of Native American population, probably a fair number of Latino, Hispanic population, fairly small amount of African American population. We see a lot of diversity when it comes to our cases. The other thing is we've got a major interstate that runs just south of me, so it brings a lot of cultural diversity to the area as well. But you've got to keep that in mind when you're working cases, that regardless of the culture, they have to feel safe. And it's your job to know at least a little bit about some of these cultures, because the cultures are going to have an effect on how the victims react to you, as well as how the offenders react to you. So knowing those cultures is going to put you further ahead. Next slide, please. All right. So in my work with the State Patrol, we don't have a Native American reservation where I'm at in Nebraska, but we border one in South Dakota. So I worked with them a fair amount. I don't know if any of you have ever seen any of the dealings with White Clay, Nebraska, and the alcohol issues that stemmed from that. It garnered a lot of national media back in 90, I'm gonna date myself a little bit now, 99. We had a lot of riots up there. I spent a lot of time in riot gear in my early law enforcement career in White Clay, dealing with a lot of the tribal issues and the alcohol issues. And with that, I built some partnerships with some of the Native American leaders up there that I carried on literally through my entire career. My last year with the State Patrol, I met with some of the AIM leaders from the American Indian Movement and some of the other tribal groups up there, still dealing with some of the alcohol issues. But because of the relationships I built with them, I could drive up the reservation and sit down with not only the tribal leaders and the tribal law enforcement, but also with the AIM leaders and that, just to see if we could find some common ground. And really that's what a lot of this is about, is finding that common ground that will help further your investigation. But it starts with building those relationships. So with each one of these circles, there's going to be a different dynamic. Be it on the federal level with the FBI, the BIA. I worked on some narcotic and violent task forces and was task force commander of one for a few years. And each one of those, it brings a different dynamic to the equation. And you have to at least understand what that dynamic is in order to help, again, keep that victim-centered approach going. Next slide, please. And a lot of that stems towards the victim's rights. So pretty much every state has some form of a victim's bill of rights now. In Nebraska's, pretty easy to find at the unicameral, or the Nebraska State Patrol has kind of the ins and outs of it posted on their website. Next slide. Very important to use it, very important to read it, and you've got to know it, because some of it will come into play in every victim's case that I work. Some of the smaller nuances of can a female victim request a female police officer to talk to? Absolutely, they can. In Nebraska, they have the right to request a different sex officer to talk to. Now, there is one caveat in Nebraska, that there has to be a female investigator or officer available that has enough training and competency to be able to carry forward the investigation. But if that's available, then absolutely we have to offer it. And truly, even if they're not fully trained in that, I'm probably still going to let them handle most of the face-to-face, and I'm just going to ride their shirt tails and make sure that they get everything right that needs to be done. But we want to make that victim as comfortable as possible, because bottom line, if they're not, nothing else is going to matter anyway, because they're not going to tell me what I need. So again, got to check that ego and get it out of the room. All right, next slide. All right, I think that wraps it up for me.
We will turn it over to Michael now, who is going to talk about the prosecution response to these investigations. So Michael, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Samantha, and thank you, Brian, for the presentation. And thanks to everybody for being here. I respect what all these folks do and what all of you do, because we really are the kind of who these people are depending on, who our victims in these cases are depending on. And so I appreciate all of your work and coming to trainings like this to try to come together and get better. Brief background, and I don't know if I have control of the slide, Samantha, but if you can just advance it. I'm from Coconino County, Arizona. I live in this town, Flagstaff, next to the mountains. This is the biggest town we have in our county, but our county is really big. Our county is the second biggest county by land area in the United States, next to San Bernardino County. We've got the Grand Canyon. We go all the way up to the Utah border. We have part of the Navajo Nation within our county's borders. And we have a lot of spread out small communities. We have places like Williams, Arizona, that's only got a few thousand people, 3,000. We've got places like Ash Fork that has a population of give or take 700. We've got places like Page that are up near the border. So we have a lot of rural communities that we serve here in Coconino County. And then before I worked here, I worked in Navajo County, the next town over in Arizona. And there we had a bunch of towns like Holbrook, Snowflake, Pine Top had 1 to 5,000 folks in each of those towns, and they were real spread out as well. So those are some of the issues that we deal with in rural communities. And also in those rural communities, the reason that we like to live in rural communities is because we know everybody. We know our neighbors. We care about our neighbors. Where it's a tight-knit community, we can pull together and help each other. Those same things that we like about these communities also bring up issues in our investigations in these communities. Everyone knows everyone, like Brian said. And so what we have to deal with is, in a prosecution, we have to consider those relationships and consider, do those present a bias that defense is going to try to argue is present in the case, a motive to lie by somebody. We have got to look at the sources of the information, the sources of these relationships in our witnesses and our victims, in our defendants, in all of the folks that are involved in the case. And in our jurors. Our jurors will also know a lot of the folks who are involved in these cases. So what can we do? What strategies can we employ to deal with all of these situations? Well, we want to gather information as early as we can about that background. So I appreciate thorough investigators like Brian who will go out and they'll ask all of the background questions. They'll get me a good family tree so I understand exactly what's going on in the cases. They'll get me these relationships so that I can ask for follow-up to deal with maybe a potential issue the defense might bring up at trial, and I can deal with those things. We're going to do interviews that are real thorough, and we're going to get our victim involved really early. Like Brian said, establish that rapport. They're not just to make the victim comfortable, which is certainly very important and we'll talk about, but also that victim is going to be a great source of information for you under the right conditions, under controlled conditions, where you're making sure that you're not leaving a trail of inconsistent statements potentially, and we'll talk about that. We want to talk about past incidents and history between, let's say, family members or members of the community, so that we know about those kinds of things that can happen. And we want to ask our victims about defense witnesses. Often, I don't know what's like in other jurisdictions. In our jurisdiction, it seems like defense discloses their list of witnesses right before trial, real late in the process. And so I always take those, and I want to take those to my victims and say, do you guys know these people? How do you know these people? What are the relationships? And so one of the things that I experienced in a recent case, it was a child molestation case, multiple generations of child molestation in this family. 4 different victims ranging from the ages of, by the time we got to trial, 35 down to like 15. And so we had a list of witnesses that were character witnesses from part of the family. And I took those names to one of my victims, and she said, yeah, I know her. She's my cousin. And she was offered to testify about how this particular victim had poor credibility. But she said, well, that's my cousin. And early on in this case, she texted me and said, hey, I hate what you're going through. I support you. I'll be there for you the whole way. And so that's pretty important evidence to have when somebody's going to turn around and say, hey, I don't think this person's a believable or a credible person. So you want to establish those relationships, get those things sorted out early. Another example from that same case in terms of jurors was we had a juror who was on our panel, got chosen for the jury. We had run out of alternates. We were stuck with the jurors we had. And then halfway through the trial, she decides to tell us, you know what, I just realized that my mom is real close friends with the wife of the defendant. And so we find that out in the middle of trial. We scrambled, we asked her all the questions. She answered them correctly, but ultimately she was the only one who hung the jury in that case, and we had to retry that case. So asking lots of questions about that stuff real early in the process is always a helpful thing. Interactions in the community. So we want our victims to feel safe, and often when they'll have run-ins in our small communities where we're going shopping or we're going to the park or whatever, they may feel intimidated. It's easy to run into each other. Sometimes frequent run-ins with the defendant who may be out of custody can result in the victim feeling intimidated or influenced. And sometimes that stuff comes through third parties. And, there's different forms this can take. It can be threatening. It can be kind of menacing someone or staring at them, or it can be just, trying to run into them so that the defendant can influence them by saying, hey, in this intimate partner violence case, I know I did something bad. I'll never do it again. Please just go to that prosecutor and tell them that you don't want to pursue this case. It can be something as simple as that. So those kinds of things are challenges, especially in our communities, because people do run into each other so often. And there's some plausible deniability there for a defendant who's running into our victims. So what can we do on that? Well, first, we want to establish our relationship with the victim early on. We want to establish that rapport and give them sort of a support system so that they can come to us if those run-ins tend to happen. We'll have release conditions from the court where we'll ask the court, we want to order with the defendant present, the judge is up there on the bench saying no contact with our victim, no contact through third parties, no contact through social media, no text messages, all of those things. If our defendant happens to be in custody, Then we want to check the jail calls, or if they were in custody and then got released, check those jail calls and see if they're calling our victim and trying to influence our victim. Those can be important evidence for you in a variety of ways. Text messages that are sent, we often have cases where we have text messages get sent between people. And if you establish that relationship early, especially with your case detective, with your law enforcement, then they know they can call that person if they get a text message. That can be documented, that can be taken to the court, and we can explain that process to them. In Arizona, we have separate protective orders that the victim can seek as well. I'm sure other states have, similar things. It's just look at your jurisdiction's law and see. Those are things that often our victim advocates will urge our victims to get, so that they have that in place as well. And then, if you can gather enough information, if you have enough information about this type of contact, file a revocation of release, try to get their release revoked for violating those things that you asked the court to order them not to do before, not to have contact with the victim, not to text, those types of things. Another thing that we have often in our cases is that news travels fast. Brian talked about gossip, and that's something that is just going to happen. Small news can be big news in these things. These kinds of cases, intimate partner violence, sexual assault, these are the kinds of cases that people watch TV shows about. They will make people talk. It's unavoidable that people are going to talk. So what can we do if it's unavoidable? What we want to do is, we can't stop this, but we don't want to contribute to it. And so, like Brian said, you want to make sure that everybody respects these facts, respects these victims' cases. And we're not going out to lunch having a loud conversation about, can you believe how crazy this case is? If we do that, people are going to hear it. And if you're a prosecutor, you shouldn't be doing that anyway. You have a duty, an ethical duty, not to spread around those types of facts. So it's good to discuss your cases with other folks in your office in order to do problem solving, in order to get ideas, but we don't want to do those conversations in public. Some filings that you make in your cases, so motions filings, motions for release, motions, pretrial motions, those things can be sealed often, and we often will seal those things to keep that information out of the public sphere. So check the law in your jurisdiction and see if you can seal some of those sensitive filings that have kind of the really private details. You want to monitor communications of the case participants. So I talked already about jail calls. You'll also want to, have the kind of rapport with your victim and hopefully establish the kind of trust where they'll tell you if there's communications. Also with your witnesses, ask your witnesses if there are any kind of communications going on. And this can go right up to trial preparation and your defense interviews. I had one situation where I had a sex assault case. Defense gave us the witness list. I was interviewing one of their witnesses for character who was a sister-in-law. And I just asked her, hey, have you talked to this defendant about what happened on this night? And she said, yes. And I said, okay, what did he say? Because he had been interviewed by the detective before, right? When the case at the outset. And she hemmed and hawed. She did not want to talk about that, but she finally did. I said, start at the beginning. Tell me everything he said. What he had told her, totally different story than what he told the detective. Certain sex act that he said he didn't remember happening. When he talked to the sister-in-law later, he did remember it happening. And he said it was an accident. And so that's stuff that, you want to monitor. But again, these kinds of close relationships that we have in small communities, they're both, difficult to deal with sometimes, but they're also, you can use them to your advantage if you can find out about those kinds of communications. And ask folks who they've talked to about the case. If you've got somebody who's going around, kind of poisoning the well with all your witnesses or something, you need to know about that in order to bring out the information and in order to, bring out that kind of influence that has happened, especially if that's someone who's connected to the defendant. Next, we want to talk about a victim-centered approach. I have some football pictures coming up. I'm originally from Iowa. You'll see some Iowa State Cyclones pictures because that's the losing often football team I root for. But we want to have a team approach to these things. And so we like to have team meetings with our victims. We have our law enforcement agent, so our case agent. We have staff that they'll be conferring with, either a paralegal or or my assistant, a victim advocate, and the prosecutor. And we want to have those meetings face to face if we can. Sometimes people are spread out, so maybe we have to do Zoom, but we'd rather not. We'd rather have them in a conference room in our office. We're seeing each other in the same room, we're talking to each other. And the big thing is, sometimes early in my career, other cases, other folks, it's sometimes tempting. You want to talk about the facts of that case. That's what you're invested in. But when you're with your victim, you do not want to leave a trail of potentially inconsistent statements that they've made, or statements that weren't recorded, or statements certainly that you were the only witness to if you're the prosecutor. Want to be real careful about that. So our practice is that we start our victim meetings with, I just want to remind you that we're not going to talk about facts in this meeting today. We're talking about the court system, how it works, what our options are in terms of trial preparation, what our options are in terms of plea negotiations. We're talking about legal things. We're not talking about the facts. We're going to be real careful about that. Sorry about that. So we do that. And then, there may be an area where you do need to follow up on facts. And so if you need to do that, you want to plan that real carefully, make sure you have a recorder on, make sure you have a law enforcement officer present to be a witness to that recording, and have a plan about what exactly you're going to talk about. Again, we're officers of truth in this business. We follow the truth. You may have things where new evidence comes to light and you have real significant questions for your victim, and you have to go in and talk to them to find out what the truth is. And if you do that, you want to do it the right way. Another part of a victim-centered approach is that safety. So we've got an offensive lineman here. We want to provide protection for our victims. So that can be court orders, arranging a safe place to stay, ways that we prevent that intimidation, that unwanted contact. We also want to plan, if there is contact, what is the victim going to do? How are they going to respond to that? And so that's why we have our law enforcement involved in these situations. We want to bring this information before the court if we can show that there's been some kind of violation of those release conditions. And then resources. Brian talked a lot about this. I'll go over it too. These can often be limited, but we want to pull together as best we can. This is why we want to have good partnerships so that we can talk to somebody about, is there a safe house? Is there a shelter? Are there vouchers for food, vouchers for clothing that we can provide to our victims if they're in a bad place? And, you as the prosecutor, you as the law enforcement officer, are a resource in terms of information about the process, information about court, information about where these things go next. Along with that protection, we also want to give some guidance and do some coaching in these conversations. Surprise is the enemy when you're dealing with your victim. You want your victim to be prepared for everything that's coming. You want them to know through honest conversations and through building that rapport that Brian talked about, that they have an idea of what's coming next. They know that trial isn't, something trivial. They know that they're going to have to testify if we go to trial, and that we will work to get them ready for that task. They know what to expect long-term. They know what to expect at each hearing. This hearing is just going to be talking about disclosure. This hearing is going to be the one where we argue out some motions that have some facts in them. You want them to be prepared for all of those things so that they trust in, the information that you're giving them, and they stay on your side. They see the process through. Like Brian said, we want to explain all of those victim rights that we have. We also want to explain legal alternatives. Often as prosecutors, plea agreements are like water to us. It's all around, but we don't realize that somebody else may need to know what that is. How does that work? So explain what is a plea agreement, explain what options we have. What will the person be facing if they're convicted at trial? What is trial like? Who will have to testify? Where will we go? Show them the courtroom, those kinds of things. And then what are the challenges in your particular case? We want to have conversations with victims. Maybe my victim at the end of my case doesn't love me, doesn't think I'm the sunniest disposition person necessarily, or that I give them the sunniest view of everything, but they should definitely know that I gave them the honest view of everything. This part we'll do well on. This part's going to be hard. We're going to have to work together and get ready for it. We want to give them honest answers so we don't lead them into a hearing where all of a sudden things are really rough and they weren't ready for that. And then they'll want to know how you can contact them with questions and how they can get their questions about the process answered, about the case answered. And then Brian talked about this too. Law enforcement partnerships are real important in these communities, especially, in our community in Northern Arizona. We're next to the Navajo Nation. So we've got tribal agencies that we deal with. We've got federal agencies we deal with, state and county folks that we deal with. You want to meet with those people if you can. Show them that you care about their cases that they're asking you for help on. Show them that it's a two-way street, that you want to help them. We're all pulling in the same direction, trying to get justice for our victims in these cases. So we want to talk to them about that in a way that treats them as pros. And, we're treating everybody, we respect everybody's work and we treat them as pros. What does that mean? That means we don't call last minute. I don't want to be the name on somebody's phone that just shows up when they want something. I want to be a giver as well as a taker. So sometimes we do have to call last minute and urgently ask for things, but we don't want that to be the only way that we have interactions with people. So we want that to be a two-way street. We want that to be a mutually respectful thing. And also, we want to have interactions with these folks, not just on occasions. We want to have regular interactions with these folks so that we're exchanging information. They understand how we work in our job. We understand what the options are in their job, and we can work together to get our common goals in that direction. Okay, Samantha.
All right, I'm going to take presenter controls back from you, Michael, just so that I have those on my side now. But thank you both for those. And just a quick reminder for those of you who are on the call with us today that are active grantees in the RVCRI program, you all do have access to no-cost tailored training and technical assistance. So that can include, some of the areas that Michael and Brian were both talking about, having relationships in place, assistance with building those relationships or talking through that. How can you establish, especially when you're considering some of your partners like tribal law enforcement, also policy review and assistance in establishing those kind of ground rules, for how these investigations will work within your agency or your department. As well as other training and technical assistance opportunities. So if you do have any of those requests related to this particular topic, please get in contact with either myself and Reginald here at the Institute or with John at LISC for your TTA points of contact. And with that, we are going to start opening it up for questions. So for those of you who have been typing and putting questions in the chat and the Q&A along the way, thank you so much. For those of you that are framing your questions now, you will have a few minutes to get those in while we walk through some of the questions that have already been submitted. So the first question that we do have coming up is, what is a DA investigator's role in cases of these natures if you've worked with them prior? So Michael, I think I'm going to pitch that one to you first.
Absolutely. So in my current job, we don't have a DA investigator in our office, but I have had one in my past job before, and we're looking for one. We would like to have one. I think that often the first thing you have to do with the DA investigator is draw the lines between what's the DA investigator going to do in an investigation as follow-up and what goes back to the investigating agency's follow-up. So do we want the police department to follow up on this? Do we want the DA investigator to follow up on this? That's going to be your leadership, like evaluating resources and determining kind of what your scope is. But I have a wish list and I have an ambitious list for my investigator. So for example, on a sex assault case, I might want them to go out and do some recorded follow-up interviews to flesh out the history of like relationships, family relationships, things we talked about in the earlier slide that come up in a small community. I'm probably going to want them to collect some digital and social media evidence and look for that stuff, kind of root out, what were the conversations going on at the time that this happened on social media. And I'm going to want them to probably be prepared, trained to explain, how this tech works, how this social media works, in order to be able to tell the jury, like, for example, Snapchat. Well, what is Snapchat? A lot of people don't know, but those of us in the business know, because it's a place where messages can be sent and then immediately deleted, which is kind of our nightmare. So we want somebody to be able to explain that. And I'm going to want them, hopefully, in like a real involved investigation. We get statistics that sex assault perpetrators are often repeat perpetrators. And so I'm going to want them, if they have the resources and they can do it, to look up every place this defendant has lived, this suspect has lived, go back, see if there are police reports, even if they didn't result in conviction, see if there are police reports where someone was reporting incidents. And I say that because I don't know if people have heard of the Darren Sharper case, but there was a safety in the NFL a few years back who left kind of a trail of these incidents, but none of them got prosecuted individually because they were hard to prove, each one of them, because the women had been given some drugs to kind of knock them out. And so once they added it up and all of the agencies talked to each other, then they saw the full picture that, yeah, this guy's going around everywhere doing it. And that evidence was admissible in those cases. So we're going to want to do that background check. Also, if we can talk to old girlfriends, that's good too, because often these things go unreported. The statistics say that 90-something% of these things go unreported. So we're going to have that kind of follow-up. Just general follow-up investigation, I think, is what I want from a DA investigator in these cases.
Great. Thank you, Michael. Brian, anything to add to that from the law enforcement side? How have you worked with a DA investigator in the past, if that's been part of your experience?
It absolutely has. The county I'm in right now has an investigator at the prosecutor's office, as well as I've worked a lot with our state attorney general's office, and they've got a full team of investigators for all the different types of crimes that they work. So I've worked with those folks a lot, and a lot of what they do from my end is they'll get with me and they'll ask me, hey, what did you see? Was there anything that you think needed a little bit more? Was there something you would have done if you'd had more time? Things like that. And, they're great to work with because it's just that they may be able to approach it from a different angle than I am able to, just because of their logistics. So no, I welcome working with DA investigators. They're a huge asset, not only for the investigation, but also during trial. Just their work with the victims and the other witnesses, leading up to and during the trial, helping just to keep the flow, and everything going. They're a great asset to have.
Great, thank you. And we do have another question here, and I'm going to be making an assumption on this acronym. So if I am wrong on that, please correct me. But we do have a question from a smaller agency in Tennessee. They said that they don't currently have a SART, which I'm going to make the assumption stands for Sexual Assault Response Team. So what would be some things that you would advise them to consider when building a team like that? And Brian, I think I'll pitch to you first, just to give Michael a break there.
Well, I'd say the first thing I would go with would be the last initial of that, which would be team. Sit down with all of the providers in your area and start putting together that team. And with each one of them, just pitch it to them. And what can you bring to this? What would you think would be valuable here? Not only your prosecutor, your law enforcement, but also, school counselors, other counselors, therapists, ER staff for the forensic exams, the forensic interviewers and things like that. Get all those people together, get everybody in the same room and just talk about it and say, hey, if we're able to put this together, what would you like to see your contribution be? And take some good notes, and don't expect it to probably happen overnight, but I would say plan on 4 or 5 meetings with refining what each one of those assets can bring to the table and keep going with it.
Thanks. Michael, anything from your perspective?
Yeah, so certainly the things that Brian said, and this is kind of assuming that what pieces you need on your team. You need a forensic examiner if you've got children. You need a forensic interviewer if you've got children, forensic examiner for any kind of sex assault. You want to have your victim advocate folks involved. You want to have prosecution involved for potential in custody charging. You want to have your law enforcement involved. So then once you have your team and you're talked about each piece that you need, then you want to talk about, and I'm going to use a scary word here, you're going to want to have a protocol. That just means that to have clean handoffs. You want to make sure that, so everybody knows victim shows up at the emergency room at 2 a.m. on a Sunday. Who goes there? Who goes there first? After they do their work, who do they hand off to? Who do they do next? We don't want to have victims sitting for long periods of time. And a lot of times, in our communities, they're spread out. So our victims may have to drive 3-4 hours or get a ride 3-4 hours to get somewhere where they can get this examination. So we don't want them sitting in the waiting room, having not been able to shower and do stuff like that for a long time, waiting for someone to then come and examine them if we can at all help it. We want to make a victim-centered approach so that if they do go through what is a very unpleasant process, that we can at least minimize the unpleasantness for them, that we can have clean handoffs and have all the information get passed in such a way that it's seamless.
Great, thank you. And I am going to skip around on questions here just because I feel like this one may tie in a little bit. But we do also have a question on, can you all talk about access to forensic medical examinations in rural communities and how law enforcement is coordinating those exams with healthcare providers? So I know, Brian, you went first last time, and I'm also going to have you go first this time since they're specifically calling out law enforcement coordination there.
Okay. So however they handled in my area, where I'm at, we have kind of the central regional hospital here just across the river from me in Scottsbluff. We've got, I believe, 3 SANE nurses there. So coordination is usually pretty easy. When I get a victim and it's a fresh enough report that there's going to be some forensic evidence or at least a possibility of it, a quick call to the emergency room and I can determine if one of those people is on staff, and if not, can we get one called in? Usually relatively simple. Now, again, in my previous life, when I was with the State Patrol covering all 11 counties in the Panhandle, that wasn't always that easy. There was, like Michael talked, there was a lot of travel. I would have to coordinate with victims and get them sometimes 2-3 hours to oftentimes here at Scottsbluff to the main hospital in the Panhandle for that. Some of the other hospitals throughout the Panhandle, they might have one provider on staff for that, and if they're not on, oftentimes because of budget, they won't call them in. So then we have to travel. So the coordination definitely kind of falls on us just to make sure we know which areas have those and knowing who to call if I need to get one called in.
Thank you. And Michael, anything from your perspective?
Sure, it's probably presupposed, the question already knows this, but it's essential. It's essential to have that access. And so if the question is because somebody's saying, well, I don't know if we can afford this. No, we have to afford this. We got to find the resources to do this. It's essential for collecting evidence, for collecting statements and things like that. I think this is part of, ideally you'll have a team and you'll have a plan for these certain days. This person, is going to be responsible for finding someone or being on staff or that kind of thing. So the coordination comes with that in terms of, that's how your multidisciplinary team or your SART team can address those things, is that they'll have that protocol in place or at least a plan, or, just the relationship. Sometimes you can lean back on just the relationships of, oh, I know who does that. It's this person. I'll call them. If they can't do it, they'll find somebody for me to go to. So that's kind of the fallback position.
All right, thank you. And our next question is related to the access and availability of shelters or housing emergency services for victims of crimes of that nature. So Brian, I know you talked about it a little bit in your position. So Michael, I'm going to ask you to chime in first on this one.
And I'm sorry, the question is how to handle shelters?
Yeah, shelters and limited access to
limited access.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Brian talked about this earlier. I think that in our community, well, in Flagstaff anyway, we have shelters. Some of the other outlying communities also have shelters. Some don't. And so you may have a drive to get to a place with a shelter. Also, those hotel vouchers or something that Brian mentioned that we certainly utilize. Certainly, you want to prioritize things. If you have somebody who it seems like there's an immediate safety issue where you think they're going to have somebody who's going to try to find them now. You probably want them in a shelter that has more security, is more secret, those kinds of things. You may want to leave the hotel for, someone who there's something happening, but it's not as immediate a threat. That's just off the top of my head. I think, the big thing is building relationships. Victim witness services in our county is who kind of helps handle this along in coordination with law enforcement. And so we have those plans kind of in place to try to source people out. But it can certainly be a challenge, especially in a spread out place. You may be asking somebody to take a long car ride to get to a shelter. And again, we have these small communities we can pull together and kind of share our resources so that we can deal with these situations as well.
Thank you. Brian, anything to add from your side?
Yeah, just to kind of add to what I said in the beginning, one of the resources we have is it's called Salvation Army funding. So we get vouchers from the Salvation Army to use for hotels, for travel, things like that. Very limited amount of funding, but that's another area where we can use them. Is if our shelter is running low on funds to get a hotel, we can usually maybe get a night, probably 2 at the most from the Salvation Army vouchers. But the other thing we might be able to do is get them a tank of gas to get out of town and get somewhere where there might be other services available. Like I said, the areas are so dramatic. One of the social media ones I worked with in kind of South Central California, this young lady's literally been in a safe house for probably almost 2 years now and hasn't paid a dime. They give her money to live on. They give her food vouchers, and she's living on full room and board because her perpetrator keeps getting out and somehow tracking her down even in the safe houses, and they keep having to move her to different safe houses. But out there, they have that available to them. And I'm blown away at the thought of having the ability to put somebody up for 2 years in a shelter. I would love to have that kind of access.
Well, I think you hit on one of the follow-up questions that we had there is the resources. So you mentioned Salvation Army funding. Are there any other resources that you all have been able to access or, make use of in terms of getting some of those vouchers? Or one individual mentioned cell phones, like prepaid cell phones for victims to be able to get in contact. What avenues have you all found that have been successful to obtain those resources? Brian, I'll start with you there.
So there are some 501c3s available in most areas if you just kind of start looking. If you check with your domestic violence groups or your child advocacy centers, they will probably have a list of some of those places that have those different resources available. I know our child advocacy center gets some money through United Way and a few other providers, specifically to use towards getting children and counseling, to helping with cell phones, things like that. The other one, like I said, that I found really amazing is social media. I work with a lot of victims on TikTok, and the funding through there has been amazing to be able to find, even just to get a Cash App out there and get some money directly to somebody to get them out of where they're at. I've been able to coordinate that for several victims on social media, and obviously it's a little tricky because you're putting all your laundry in the air out there to a very large audience, and so most victims aren't comfortable with that. Totally understandable, but for the ones that are at least limited, it opens up a little bit more of an avenue of revenue stream to get the help they need to get out of there.
Thank you. And Michael, anything to add on that one?
Just briefly, I think Brian's more well versed on the kind of the 501c's and things like that you can go to. I don't have any specifics on that. I do know that our local victim witness organization, we do a lot of local fundraising. So I go to their dinners and stuff, and we try to raise a lot of funds that way in order to get those vouchers. Local businesses will often contribute those vouchers so that we can distribute those to folks who need them.
Great, thank you. We do have a couple of other questions that have come through, but we are, coming up right here on time. So for those folks who have entered questions in that we haven't gotten to yet, I will circle back with Brian and Michael and get their responses to those questions and send to you all, but I do want to be respectful of the time that we're at today. So I am switching over to our contact information slide here. You can see my information is there, as well as Brian and Michael's, if you would like to reach out or if you have any questions. We are happy to answer them. Also on the slide, you will see a QR code. for our survey. My colleague is also going to put the link in the chat. So if you'd rather scan it or click the link, you can get to that survey either way. Again, it should only take a couple of minutes, and we do appreciate that feedback. It helps us improve for all of our future events. With that, I just want to thank everyone for joining us today and thank our two presenters for the great information that they've shared. And again, if you all do have questions or would like additional follow-up, feel free to reach out. And I hope you all have a great rest of your afternoon. Thanks so much.